I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so excited to be joined by Rachel Kushner. I know we've all read The Flamethrowers, we've read The Mars Room, and now there's a new book for us all to be excited about. This is something that I was so excited when I first saw that this was coming, and I can't wait to talk about it. You've been a finalist for the National Book Award, on the short list for the Booker Prize, and just today, as we're recording, we found out that this book, Creation Lake, is on the long list for the Booker Prize as well. So thank you so much for being with us to talk about Creation Lake.
Thank you for hosting me, Jenna. It's an honor to be here.
So I think I'd like to ask you to set up the story for us a little bit, because it is a fun one, and it's something that I didn't quite expect. When I saw noir and spies, I was like, oh, okay, I'm on board for this.
Yeah, let's see if I can do it. So Creation Lake is a novel about an American woman in her early 30s who used to work for American federal authorities as an undercover agent. But something went wrong and she was ejected from that role and ended up finding a new life using the same set of skills to dissimulate working for shadowy people in business and government who hire her to mostly surveil and provoke activists in order to get them out of the way if they are interfering with the pursuit of power or profit. And she is in France when the book starts. The entire book takes place there, paying attention to surveilling a group of young people who have decamped from Paris and other large bourgeois cities to try to make a communal life in a rural outpost in central southwestern France. They have a kind of mysterious mentor that they have adopted, who is something of a anti-civilization thinker. His name is Bruno Lacombe, and he writes long communiques to them. And the narrator, who tells the people she's surveilling that her name is Sadie, Sadie Smith, but doesn't give away her real name. She is reading his communiques. She has broken into his email account. And the book opens with her summarizing Bruno's set of thoughts about human history, where we've gone, and where we are going. And over the course of the book, she is there as an agent of destruction to intervene in the plans of the young communards who have come to live communally in this place. And she is reading Bruno's letters, and it's unclear if she will be found out and or if she, thinking that she is the seductress of the world that she's found herself in, is being seduced by Bruno. Yes. How did I do? Because you've read the book, so I should have just asked you to do this work for me.
I know. It's the sneaky thing of having the authors do their elevator pitch right off the bat when I'm like, I've been poring over this book nonstop, but it was great. That is an incredible nutshell. There's so much that happens, I think, in this book. And many of them are things that I did not expect. And I had a lot of fun sort of wondering from page to page where exactly things were going to go, or if things were happening exactly as I thought they were. And I think that's the joy of this sort of genre, is that you don't ever quite know exactly what's happening or if it's happening the way it should. So I guess I have to ask right off the bat, how did this story come to you, and why did you choose to sort of tell it in this noir thriller way? Because when I first, read the description and saw this sort of climate activism and all, and then the first page is Neanderthals, that's not a spoiler, I was like, okay, all right.
Yeah, Neanderthals were prone to smoking and depression, to paraphrase
I feel that.
The first line. It came together in different ways, but first maybe I want to answer your very apt question about the form, if only to say that, I don't consider this novel to be a noir per se, given that that genre is a serious one, and there are many practitioners of it, and they submit to a set of rules, and I think that rule-based art is not in a lower hierarchy than art that doesn't have that set of rules. Like songwriting, for instance, is like it's an incredibly practiced art to learn the rules and the conventions of structure. Noir also has a structure, so I wouldn't try to claim that Creation Lake submits to that. But I borrowed certain elements of noir. A friend of mine who knows me very well and has read all my books, she's an artist, she said, well, I wouldn't call it a noir, but that it is as if the narrator is in a noir, but the book itself is by you. So I'll talk about the genesis of it, but when I did adopt for her the fact that she's a spy, it's a ready-made noir scenario. And inside of that, I see suddenly so many of the attractions to writing in that genre. First and foremost being when you have a narrator who is watching and planning and manipulating the world around her, you have no need for something that every literary writer has need of, which is a conceit called the coincidence. And I think that it's very tempting for writers. And one of the major objectives of writing a novel is to avoid the coincidence because it's a little bit cheap. And that's why I don't always like novels that kind of come together into some grand synthesis where it turns out that these two people are related or they just happen to be from the same town. But when you write a noir, there's no need for coincidence because your narrator is pulling all of the strings. The other thing about it that I found really fun, and I learned from my favorite crime writer, a French writer from the 70s named Jean-Patrick Manchette, is narrators in crime novels are capable of being greatly active. And I've often had narrators who were more like real people. And real people are not always the actors in a room. They're absorbing and thinking and listening and questioning and trying to figure out what their role is. But in a noir, the narrator, has plans in her head and a gun in her hand, and it just streamlines and propels you along. And that maybe was what allowed me to write this book that had very short chapters. I wanted to see if I could kind of have a spring-loaded energy from one small part to the next. In terms of the idea, it was a few things. I have long wanted to write a book about a group of young people who, decamp from French industrialized cities and try to form a commune in the countryside and are sort of set on a collision course with the French state. Like that would be the tension of the book. At the same time, when I finished my last novel, The Mars Room, I don't know why I got interested in prehistory and some of the advances that were being made in terms of mapping the human genome and compared to the Neanderthal genome, and seeing that a lot of this research was totally upending what people thought they knew about human migration patterns and interbreeding of they aren't different species because they're able to make children who are fertile, but different strands of the human tree. And I thought, whoa, this is like the greatest story never told. And for a while, I even toyed with the idea of writing a novel that would be set entirely 30,000 years ago. And then I decided, I think there's only one person who could pull that off well. And that would be Cormac McCarthy, because he's such an extreme behaviorist. It's mostly men, but it's men who think and do and carve and sharpen knives and ride horses. And you would have to write it from outside because we just don't know. It would seem artificial to use all of the range and faculty of language that we have, not to say that I have it in any particular way, but so I was thinking about that. And somehow the two just came together for a variety of reasons that have to do with yearnings by activists, not just now, but all through the 20th century, to find a way to live that seems aligned with some kind of essential human grace. And so I posed to myself and to my characters questions about where we have come from and where we are going. And for Bruno, my character, it's a question of, did those who came before know something that we don't? And did they leave any trace of a message that might be useful to us? Us who have taken a wrong turn, us for whom this wrong turn might not have been inevitable. History is never inevitable. It has drift and chance to it. So, like, all this thinking started to happen, and then it became enfolded in the plot of these young people in rural France. The most difficult thing about the novel was to figure out, well, who's telling it? And why is the person telling it there? And I started writing a narrator who was reading Bruno's communiques. And then she started having these like sort of sarcastic asides while reading them. And I realized, oh, she's there with ill intent. And it just all became very clear to me quickly. But that was after like 3 years of attempts and a genesis. And then suddenly I was able to write the book.
I love the almost epistolary feeling of reading along with Bruno's communiques as it goes and just sort of understanding things as they happen, but also in a way that it changes how I think we look at all of these characters once we pull out, like if you pulled out all of the pieces of just Bruno and put them together, I think you'd have a story all in itself. And I really enjoyed that back and forth, especially since you were saying these chapters are short. You're moving through so fast, but I always wanted to stop on those chapters with Bruno.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. When you say epistolary, I'm reminded that for myself, when I'm reading a novel that switches back and forth between two accounts, and one maybe is the prehistory to the present day action, even if it's not in italics, it is in spirit in italics. And I kind of want to rush through to get back to the present day part. And so I think I was very aware of my own preferences as a reader and wanted to keep the Bruno parts to a velocity that matched the rest so that it never feels quite like a pause, if that makes sense. I mean, he is the heart of the book in a way for me. And I've been kind of surprised, but pleased to have people say, I'm really into Bruno. Maybe my friends are flattering me, but they refer to him almost as if he's a real person.
I mean, he was one of definitely my favorite parts of the book. I just found myself returning to his ideas and to just wanting to connect so much with what he was saying. Not to say that the entire thing hadn't completely enraptured me, because it had, but it has just this tone that clicks, I think. Mm-hmm. Especially in contrast with Sadie and the idea of her voice being so radically different, I think on so many levels. It's interesting, I think, along with what you were saying about coincidence, this sort of book allows us something that I don't think we get very often in literature either, which is reading a story and being in a perspective from a character who by design we cannot and do not know anything about, only these very select choice things. And even then we're always questioning what is the real thing, and to sort of be unraveling that as it goes, it really pushes the story.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Yeah. I sometimes think writing narrators in the first person, at least for me, is the hardest thing to do, because you're performing an I, but under the guise of an avatar. And I don't just use myself in these characters. I mean, sometimes to a degree we all do, but there's a way in which they have to be at a distance from me and be totally, for me, believably a different I. Like I'm behind the scenes driving them like a vehicle. And with her, she was immediately very different from me. And I think that started to kind of the raison d'etre of building her character was to supply her with parts and attributes that I myself do not possess. And so it was like a study in opposites that became quite logical for me. I would be very focused on how I'm coming across to other people, making sure they like me, trying to read what they're thinking so that I can learn more about myself, them, and the world. And she is not like that at all. She thinks she has other people's number and she's one step ahead of them. Whereas I would be more ontologically oriented almost to position myself one step behind, not because I see myself as inferior, but because that I want to move through the world learning something all the time about other people. For the first part of the book, Sadie is not like that. But maybe she has my vulgar and juvenile sense of humor. She was a fun outlet for that.
At first, I found myself wanting to call her an unreliable narrator. And then I was like, well, but is she? Or is she actually telling me exactly who she is the whole time? And maybe this whole idea of unreliable narrator doesn't quite apply in the way that I wanted it to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that is a completely valid question to which I don't have a final answer. On the one hand, I would say, well, she's not an unreliable narrator. You know, she's a perfectionist and she makes that clear. And whether or not she delivers on her pledge to herself to never make mistakes is up to the reader to decide. But in terms of who she is, so she, it's not a game that she plays with the reader, but a kind of formal game that I played with myself, which seemed like a generative challenge, was she only shares autobiographical backstory with the reader that is a set of instances, half scenes where she was dissimulating in some other situation. And that was kind of the rule. It's never like, oh, you know, my mother was mean to me or, you know, my parents were divorced or something. It's on my first job, you know, busting a set of bikers for racketeering, this happened. And she's acting, and maybe the book is acting as though there's, at least for me, some humor and play there to building the sedimented layers of psychology through all the different instances where she screwed other people over prior to the current situation in which the reader watches her screw a new set of people over or try to.
I think performance kept coming up for me. This idea that Sadie is performing not only for the, you know, groups that she is trying to infiltrate or the people that have hired her, but she's also performing something for the reader and trying to sort of watch what that is and how it unfolds. I think lets us in on a deeper sense of her, whether or not she would like that.
I think that's true. I think that's really insightful. I have often used a first person voice that wasn't really a performative voice. But in this case, she's a little emphatic in ways that the reader can take a distance from. You know, when you said that thing about unreliable narrators, and I said, you know, on the one hand, I would say, no, she's totally reliable. On the other, I immediately remembered that right before I started, I had been working on this book for 3 years, trying to write it. And right before I really launched into, oh, I know how this is going to work, and I wrote the whole thing in 14 months, I had reread Nabokov's Pale Fire, which has like a famously unreliable narrator. And there is something very exciting about that book. And maybe it isn't an unreliable narrator is technically the term doesn't include an effect that a narrator like that can create, which is that they're like a polyrhythm because they're saying one thing in one register and another in another. And Charles Kinboat, the narrator of Pale Fire, presents himself as this, you know, revered scholar of the poetry of John Shade, and he also thinks that he's an escaped king from the nation of Zembla. And he's letting you know that he's mad as a hatter, but that there's an intensity to his pursuit, and he's going to drop clues. So I don't know. I guess, I may have been slightly influenced by a famously unreliable narrator.
I think that it all comes together, and there she goes through a lot. We'll just put that. I'm not going to go into it because you got to experience it for yourself with the book, but there's a lot there. And I think all the pieces coming together, especially against this backdrop that she's in this French countryside, I kept finding myself thinking, like, this does feel very French. And I'm like, is this book, in a line with a Truffaut film, or, something like the Cassavetes moment, where I'm like, I could feel these things coming together.
But she's pretty bluntly American.
I know she is. Yes, absolutely. And I think that, and that is something that gets called so frequently forward, this idea that she, no matter what she's doing, she is on the outside, and she's choosing that. I think of the moments where she sort of ups and downs how perfect her French is, even with her American accent, but she uses all these things. She's so acutely aware of her surroundings, even for someone who, does not sort of exist as an insider here. She's trying so hard to make those connections.
Yeah, her facility with languages is one more trait I've bestowed her with that I myself do not possess.
I think that is a hard one. And I think especially when you're writing for varying audiences, I think the American and French audience often get very split down the middle of our sensibilities, I suppose. You often return to characters in moments of transition and change. There's a lot of transition here for our characters. They're constantly moving, they're constantly going forward, and Sadie herself has experienced many moments of transition, and those sort of things are revealed as they go forward. Is that something that you think you come back to on purpose, somewhere you find inspiration, or is that just how we write good stories, is looking for people in transition?
I've never really thought of it that way, but maybe the form of the novel asks the reader, it asks of the writer to justify the occasion on which the story is being told. So, an occasion of absolute stasis, it could be done in a novel, but there's usually some fantasy that gets traversed, some ground that gets covered, some change that comes about. I would also say, for me as the writer, I never want to write a book where I could just make an outline and then, just show up, punch my time clock, and write each chapter, finish them over a series of months or years, and then the book is done. Obviously, no book really can be written that way, but I want to be surprised by the process. Some synthetic genesis truly has to occur, where by the time I'm tumbling toward the end, I feel that I'm set on a course that is totally surprising to me, but deeply affirmingly inevitable feeling. And I think that it would be hard to get that if it were like a formal avant-garde precept where people are just like a Buñuel movie sitting at a dinner table and they can't leave. There's a way to do that, but generally speaking, something needs to happen for me to feel this sense of, on the one hand, surprise, and then on the other, inevitability. This book, I would say, is like the most direct and compressed in terms of series of actions, because it takes place in one region over about 6 weeks with one set of characters, and it never switches out of the voice of the narrator, even as she kind of goes quiet as she summarizes Bruno's story. And maybe by design, on my part at least, the reader forgets that she's the one telling and lets Bruno's voice rise up to the fore. But really, it's a first-person novel. It's all her. It's all one place. And it's this, it's one summer. So within that, about transition, I hadn't really thought things through like that.
I think that's the joy of novels we all get to find. I think it'd be very unexciting if we all found the exact same things as we read and as we read.
No doubt, yeah.
And I think something that I enjoy so much of your work is this idea of coming in, and I feel like I can put in my own work and get something back as well. I think that's something that excites me the most in a novel in literature. I think it's something so unique and special, is like you really can put in so much of yourself and get a reflection back versus, sometimes in a film or other genres that are really beautiful and wonderful in their own ways, we're presented with so much of exactly what there is going to be.
Wait, say more about that if you don't mind.
I think that when I come to a novel, I want to be in communion almost with it. I want to put so much of myself in to get something back. I love movies and TV, all of that very much, but I think something about the visual medium supplies you with so much more of the
yes,
artists.
Absolutely. Right.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. A few things I would say in response to that. I've said this before here and there, but I really feel like the novel is the art form that gives us the closest, most lifelike experience of what it's like to be inside someone else's consciousness. And that is an automatic intimacy between reader and book. The book is not exactly what it's like to be the person who wrote it, but the person who wrote it took all of the stimulus and input of the living, reverberating world around her and everything she's ever soaked in and imagined, experienced in her life, and it is put into a new synthetic order that is almost dictated by, if she's lucky, her unconscious. It's like there's a part of you that's smarter than you. And then you make this world in a book, which is, a parallel universe to this one, which shares many of its traits and maybe can offer some of its truths up. And that's so much between, the reader definitely completes the book. I sometimes think of the world itself as the final element of the book, almost like a sculpture that sits on a plinth. Like the world is merely there to hold the book in place. I think this is also something that writers have to relearn over and over, but in a really wonderful way, is to let the reader complete the scene. Let them complete it. Give them their share of the work to do. And in that sense, there's a very delicate balance that needs to be struck between a half-formed image, that is half-baked, and an image that is clear but is open and extends out to the reader to complete, whereby that wonderful intimacy is formed between reader and book.
I think that's what allows literature to do so much for, bringing people together is sort of a grand phrase and can mean many different things, but when I want to see humanity and to understand the world that we live in, especially something like Creation Lake, where this literally is about the formation of humanity in many ways, to sort of have that experience of allowing myself to drift with what does that mean? Where did we come from? It's an experience that is very unique that I think only literature can bring us.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also I love to read for perhaps, in addition, more selfish reasons. I feel cleaner when I'm reading novels. And I don't mean, in terms of clean versus dirty, but there's a certain spiritual hygiene that is available to me when I'm reading books. I feel a kind of refinement in my senses and an openness to the world around me, which is almost counterintuitive, because to read a book is kind of to be to the side of life. And yet it plunges me into an interest in other people in a way that, some of the more diversionary, ultra contemporary modes of being do not offer me that kind of spiritual hygiene.
There's a slowness and a different pace that I think it really allows for a reader. But I have to ask, since we're talking about your reading, some of your literary influences, whether on this book or just in general, some things you really love.
in terms of this book, Jean-Patrick Manchette, the French crime writer, was an influence. I wouldn't claim that my books are like his, but my book was kind of written in homage to him. He is incredibly funny and stylish and brilliant and writes short, insanely violent, but very pithy little novels. He wrote like 10 in 10 years in the 1970s, and then he died in 1995. And I was looking at his work. As I mentioned, Nabokov's Pale Fire was probably of influence in this book. Strangely, I doubt anyone else would ever see an overlap, but there's an early Cormac McCarthy novel, one of his first three, Child of God, is a book I've really looked at and even studied because it has a kind of formal concision, and concision, is that a word? It's concise, perfection to it. And I would look at the first page. I would look at the first chapter, which I think was about a page and a half. I would look at the first 30 pages and try to figure out how he could propel story and be so light on his feet, but also use this earthy, simple, but kind of biblical tone. That book also just so happens to take place for its, I think, second half, or at least the final third, in the caves of, I think it's southern Kentucky. So there's a cave thing going on there. In terms of writers generally, I love Proust. I don't know what I learned from Proust, but I adore him. I love Marguerite Duras. As I like to say, I consider her to be my big daddy, but I would never try to write like her, compare myself to her, but of like French 20th century writers. Celine, Louis Ferdinand Celine, enters into this novel because the narrator is reading like a cheap, puffy paperback copy of a biography of Celine. And I was reading that biography while I was writing it, which was just full of outrageous tidbits. Celine was a madman. Not all of his beliefs are ones that I would co-sign, obviously, but as a stylist, he was just insanely talented and entertaining, bleak. I think that to have that kind of style, you also have to be a nihilist. There's a way in which his hyperbole is generated by somebody who doesn't really care or has let go of caring. But Journey to the End of the Night is a book that I learned a lot from, about how to go ahead and exaggerate to bring things up a notch and create a sense of music.
I can see those influences in there. It makes a lot of sense. I have to ask one other thing before we wrap up. I wonder, because there is so much descriptive detail in this, from types of cars, which I know you love, different kinds of wine, and sort of all of this Neanderthal stuff. What kind of research did you do for this book? Do you research, or is it more of just that you amass things as you go?
I think more amass as I go. But so in the case of the setting, I have been going with my husband and my son to a part of rural central southwestern France, the same set of villages every summer for like 15 years. And our son went to a camp in this very, very rural little corner between the Lot and the Dordogne departments, starting when he was 7. And the last 2 years he worked at that camp as a guide, and he would bring children into caves. And he himself is an expert on the caves in this region of France. So some of what I needed for the book was just coming across my vision, and was there available to me in a very organic way. I tend to shy away even from the semantics of research. I don't know quite why, but I think it's because novels for me are, as I said before about them being like, I've taken all this input from the world and of my own memories and who I am as a person, and then it's like you make this synthetic round that kind of can form a logic of all these disparate parts. And that experience for me would it wouldn't be the same if I were artificially learning things just to put them into a book. Once in a while you have to fact check something or look it up. But for the most part, I pursue my own natural interests and then write a novel that happens to dovetail with those interests. And in this case, I was acquiring a lot of familiarity with rural France, and I was interested in the history of these parts of rural France have like a long history of revolt and rebellion. Not just 20th century. Like my son would say, oh, we see graffiti in the caves from resistance fighters who were hiding from the Nazis during World War II, because the Nazis came through this part of France and they burned all these villages, and people retreated and hid from them. And there's the kind of this is like more leftist communist peasant culture in these parts of rural France. But there were peasant rebellions in these places, in the 14th century and even earlier. And some of that I would think, oh, this is interesting for the book, and then turn to read more about it. But it was never not a natural interest of my own to begin with.
I think that makes sense. I think you can sort of feel in novels when something might have been homework for someone versus when it really comes from within and from an interest that they may have.
Yeah, like I'm not interested in like, oh, my character needs to have a profession. Let's make him a dentist. I'll learn something about dentistry or whatever. Like in this case, it's more, I'm just so eager to build a structure in which people can operate in a world that's already familiar to me. But I want the reader to feel like they are in authoritative hands. And I couldn't do that if I was learning things whole cloth just to put them in a book.
I always want to end with some people's least favorite question, which is like, what are you working on next? Which I know can be something people don't want to talk about. And then we get a situation like we had when I ask you if this book used to be called something else because I found a weird whisper on the internet about it. But
yeah, I didn't mind that. It's like, it's flattering that anyone should even care what I'm writing or what it used to be called. The day I take that for granted and get annoyed is the day I have lost the thread. The thread is gratitude. It's so great to be able to write novels and have people read them. It's like the most special thing in the whole world. But to answer your question, which I don't mind at all, because it's an easier one to answer. The bad news is I'm not working on a novel right now. I would like to. I have 2 ideas for novels, and I'm not really sure how I'm going to go about that. Like, do you kind of bet on both horses and see which one pulls ahead? Or do you leave one in the stable and start training the other? But in the meantime, I am finishing, hopefully today or tomorrow, an 11,000 word essay for Harper's Magazine on the past and future of hot rodding in America. And I've been researching this piece for 9 months, and it's just been an absolute blast for me to write.
That's very exciting. I think there's going to be a lot of people who have a lot to look forward to in reading that. And
I don't know. Some people, they're going to be like, fuel, nitromethane, cars, the drag strip. Why? But the trick is always to try to make it fun for people and bring them along. So I hope I've done that.
I believe you have. And in the meantime, we have Creation Lake, and we can be very patient about new novels. That's what we're good at.
Well, thank you so much again. I mean, thank you for reading the book, for having me on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Of course. So Rachel Kushner, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about Creation Lake. And I can't wait to see where this book goes. And there's so much backlist to pick up as well. So if you haven't picked it up yet, please get your hands on Creation Lake.
Thank you so much, Jenna.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of fantastic books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Creation Lake. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by my book buddy Donald in Detroit. Hi, Donald. How are you?
I'm doing great, Mark. Really excited episode we got going on today.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and have you kick things off because I think we're both very excited about anything Rachel Kushner, specifically this book, which is such a blast. So why don't you go ahead and take things away?
All right, thank you, Mark. Yeah, Creation Lake was a book I was excited about. The arc came in several months ago, grabbed it, read it. I've read it twice now in preparation of this podcast episode. And I'll tell you, the one thing that really comes to mind is how unique Rachel Kushner's writing is. She is unlike any other writer that you'll come across. And in Creation Lake, she has a strong character in Sadie. So this was a tough one to find a book that I could balance. What I really was looking for was another book with a really strong, identifiable female character. I went through dozens of books and finally landed on a modern classic, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And the reason why, again, is because we are dealing with a super strong, very unique individual in Lisbeth Salander. You could almost say, because she's a hacker, that spy versus spy almost, right? We got Sadie, who is a spy, and then we've got Lisbeth, who is essentially doing the same thing. But the other thing that really connected these two books together for me is they also have very interesting male secondary characters, right? There's Michael in the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and there's Bruno in Creation Lake. And they also play off each other really well as companion books. The bigger picture between these two, and another reason why I picked The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, is it's a psychological thriller. Creation Lake is a bit of a thriller, although a little bit more spoofy and strange. But they also are dealing with really major issues, right? Creation Lake is dealing with, eco-terrorism, climate, whereas Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is dealing with, Swedish Nazism, financial corruption, murder, sexual abuse. So they're both dealing with heavy topics. Creation Lake just does an amazing job at kind of creating this almost panel-like viewpoint, like you might find in a comic book almost, to tell these stories. But a couple other things, too, is you've got, with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, not only a strong female character, but a character that's been through a lot. And that also shows dramatically in Creation Lake. And interestingly enough, with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, that is not the name that was originally given to it in Sweden. I can't pronounce it, so I'm not even going to try, but I can tell you what it actually translates to is Men Who Hate Women. And that's what the original title of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is. And I think that also speaks very well to why these two books go hand in hand. Sadie and Lisbeth, if they ever met, I think they would be really good friends, maybe distrustful at first, but there's a duo you'd love to see in some kind of a team up. So again, my book this time around is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson. Mark, what do you have for us?
Oh, that's such a fun pick, and one of those that is on the general collective memory of every bookseller. We have seen it, especially the ones who have been around the block for a long time, like you and I, and it just sort of sits in the back of our head always. So to kind of bring it back up and give it some justice is always a good thing. So I was thinking about Rachel Kushner, and okay, so bear with me. There's just this general coolness about Rachel Kushner in her writing that is just very undeniable to me. She tells incredible stories, but she has this sort of effortless level of cool that you just want to be a part of. It reminds me of a Jennifer Egan, an early days Janet Fitch, just a Tessa Moshfegh, just an author who is very singular, but you just know through her writing that she's somebody that you kind of want to hang out with. So I wanted to recommend somebody who has a similar level of cool girl vibe. And I thought of the fantastic Calla Henkel. You might remember her electric debut, Other People's Clothes, which I loved. And it blends social commentary and humor with this kind of thriller undercurrent. It's kind of laced with danger in a really interesting way. But her newest book is the one I want to talk about, and that is Scrap. It just recently came out, and it's so fun. It follows a woman named Esther, who is an artist and kind of on the edge of plummeting in her life. So she takes on this unusual job of creating a scrapbook for an absurdly wealthy couple. So as she's sifting through boxes and boxes of notes and photos and literal scraps of these people's lives, she gets sucked into their orbit as this kind of hungry outsider to a degree that is a little unsettling. Like, calm down, Esther. But also, what fun would it be if she was just not that excited about these folks, because they are fascinating and have a lot of layers to this relationship. And then the wealthy wife dies, and Esther's life starts to spiral even further out of control to a degree that is entirely entertaining and very fun to read. So this is a thriller of sorts, but also a look at art and at wealth and uneasy choices. And all of it just feels just so damn cool. I think Calla Henkel is a voice who I really want to follow in years to come. She's somebody who is really doing something elevated and interesting, and I can't wait to read more from her. So please check out Scrap by Calla Henkel. But guess what? That's all we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Pour It Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. And you can follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
You can follow my store at BN Fairlane Green.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Pour It Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.